Papoose, you have my lawyer's information. If you can't afford to retain a lawyer, since your lawyer that the number you gave us has not been retained yet, I told you I'll paper it. If somebody over there that loves you wants to paper it, great. That will make me happy. Everything is signed and ready to go. I don't want nothing. I'm not even asking for child support. My daughter's school, her babysitter, her nanny, her gymnastics, her swimming, her dancing, her healthcare, her all of that. I take care of it like I've always done. I don't need anything.
I just like to express this one thing. All these girls be like, thank you to my man. And I want to say, to my hands, thank you to my hands. To my hands, thank you to my hands. Listen, for me knowing how to fight and me training hard, I make millions of dollars just from beating people up. So, to my hands, thank you to my hands. To my hands, thank you to my hands.
Papoose had roughly 72 hours before the carefully constructed layers of his double, maybe even triple, life began to fall apart. What started as whispers and fragmented online conversations quickly turned into something far more difficult to contain. And the name tied to every piece of that collapse was not Claressa Shields. It was Kadia Auburnson, a name that many people online still struggle to pronounce correctly, and one that much of the New York hip-hop scene has seemingly chosen to ignore. To be clear, the pronunciation is Kadia, sometimes referenced online in different variations, but the central figure remains the same. That woman, according to long-standing claims within this narrative, is the same individual Remy Ma had allegedly warned about years earlier, long before multiple albums, tours, and even a prison sentence became part of the public record. But at the time, few people were willing to listen to the voice of a wife who, from her perspective, believed she already understood what was unfolding behind the scenes. When you strip this entire situation down, removing the PR framing, the polished interviews, and the carefully curated Instagram captions, what remains does not resemble a typical rap feud, or even a standard cheating scandal. Instead, it starts to look like something more structured and layered, almost like a coordinated business ecosystem where personal relationships and professional interests overlap in ways that are difficult to separate. At the center of it all is a quiet figure, positioned in such a strategic way that by the time Claressa Shields began to realize what was happening around her, she was already deeply entangled in circumstances she did not fully understand. This account is not presented as gossip, but as a reconstruction of events based on circulating claims and timelines. And within that reconstruction, one interpretation becomes increasingly clear. Remy Ma was not reacting for attention or drama. She was responding to what she believed was a much larger structure operating behind the scenes. To understand this perspective, you have to go back, not to headlines, not to diss tracks, and not to viral clips, but further, to around 2021. That year, buried beneath a wave of mixtape releases and rapid creative output, contains details that many people now revisit with new scrutiny. During that period, Papoose was heavily involved in distributing music through platforms like TuneCore, releasing content at an intense pace. To some observers, it appeared as though he was trying to prove something, maintain momentum, or possibly stay ahead of something unfolding privately. On one of those tracks, Counting Green, alongside Busta Rhymes, a featured artist named Kadia appeared. At the time, she was not widely recognized by mainstream audiences. However, within this narrative framework, her appearance is viewed as more than a simple collaboration. It is interpreted as an early integration into a creative and professional orbit that would later expand significantly. The connections deepen when examining surrounding relationships. Kadia's cousin, a producer known as Shatu Miles, is said to have worked on Papoose'S Bars on Wheels series and produced the track Faithful. In parallel, her father, Ruben Branson, is associated with Win Records, a label reportedly named after Kadia's daughter, Winnie. These overlapping ties form a network that, when viewed collectively, appears more interconnected than a standard industry collaboration. Fast forward to reports circulating around 2025 and 2026, and Win Records allegedly signs Claressa Shields to an $8 million deal. Around the same time, Papoose is appointed head of hip-hop at the label. a role similar to one he previously held under TuneCore. Same position, same individual, different company, but still within a framework that appears connected to the same inner circle. At that point, what initially looks like a major career move for a boxing champion begins to take on a different tone for some observers. Instead of being viewed purely as an independent opportunity, it is interpreted by critics as part of a larger system, one that may influence branding, visibility, and financial direction in ways that extend beyond Claressa herself. From this perspective, the structure begins to resemble a controlled ecosystem rather than isolated career decisions. Claressa's fame, earnings, and public image are seen as potentially flowing through channels already shaped by Kadia and her extended network. Whether intentional or not, this interpretation suggests a layered arrangement where business and personal relationships overlap heavily. Turning attention toward Claressa Shields herself, the narrative becomes more emotionally charged. She is often described in this account as reactive, expressive, and highly engaged in public discourse. At various points, she is said to have repeatedly engaged with diss tracks, online arguments, and lyrical references she claimed were not directed at her, while simultaneously reacting to them in ways that suggested she felt targeted. Observers argue that this level of reaction does not emerge in isolation. It typically indicates deeper emotional or personal involvement. In this case, Claressa's responses are interpreted as evidence that she was closer to the situation than she publicly acknowledged. While much of her focus appeared directed toward Remy Ma, others argue that the more significant developments were occurring elsewhere, outside her immediate attention. Within this interpretation, Remy Ma is not positioned as the central force of conflict. Instead, she is viewed as someone who observed patterns over time and attempted to voice concerns that were repeatedly dismissed. Meanwhile, Kadia remains a quieter presence, less visible publicly, but consistently present within the structural and relational framework being described. This is where the narrative shifts again. Claressa is increasingly portrayed not as the core of the situation, but as a visible focal point, someone whose public presence draws attention away from underlying dynamics. In that sense, she is compared to a distraction, highly visible, emotionally engaged, but not necessarily positioned at the center of decision-making. Even external commentators such as Frank Cruz Discern are cited within this perspective as having hinted that Claressa was not at the top of the structure, but rather positioned lower within it. Claressa, however, reportedly dismissed such interpretations and continued focusing on direct interpersonal conflicts rather than broader structural claims. Meanwhile, according to this narrative, the individual benefiting most was not always the most visible. Instead, it was the quieter presence, Kadia, who remained partially out of the spotlight while still maintaining consistent connections to both creative and business aspects of the ecosystem. The timeline becomes even more important when revisiting earlier allegations. When the situation involving Easy the Block Captain became public, Remy Ma's response is framed as unsurprised rather than shocked. From this point of view, she had already been aware of earlier rumors, alleged connections, and private tensions long before they reached public awareness. These included claims about prior relationships, alleged children, and industry connections that were circulating quietly within certain circles. In this interpretation, Remy Ma had already been raising concerns for years, but her warnings were often dismissed or overshadowed by public loyalty to Papoose'S image and career. This is where Papoose'S role becomes more complex. In this framework, he is not only seen as an artist but also as a brand identity and business figure. His public image is described as tightly linked to professional relevance, audience retention, and industry positioning. Supporters argue he benefited from Remy Ma's visibility, while critics claim he simultaneously developed parallel structures outside the marriage. From this angle, the marriage itself is interpreted less as a purely personal relationship and more as a strategic anchor that helped maintain public perception and career continuity. Whether or not that interpretation is accurate, it reflects how deeply intertwined personal and professional narratives have become in this story. The defense of Papoose becomes more complicated when examining timelines. Some argue that alleged infidelity began only after public tensions involving Remy Ma and Easy the Block Captain emerged. However, within this reconstruction, Earlier collaborations, industry ties, and rumored connections suggest that certain dynamics may have existed long before that point. A particularly notable reference comes from a 2023 track in which Kadia allegedly delivered lyrics interpreted as expressing a desire to assume a role similar to the one Remy Ma holds in Papoose'S life. This line, depending on interpretation, can be read not as casual expression but as symbolic positioning, suggesting replacement rather than admiration. In contrast, Claressa's public portrayal in interviews has often been described as uncertain or unclear regarding her relationship status. Meanwhile, Kadia is depicted as being more structurally embedded through music credits, family ties, and industry associations. Even the presence of a child named Winnie becomes part of the timeline analysis, with observers attempting to align dates and events to establish coherence. Another layer is added through social media activity. Just days before broader public attention intensified, Papoose reportedly posted a birthday message for Kadia on Instagram. The tone of that message is described as unusually formal and appreciative, highlighting her importance, reliability, and role within ongoing projects. For some, this reads less like casual acknowledgement and more like recognition of an established internal position. Within that same framework, Claressa's music career is portrayed as struggling to gain consistent traction. Releases such as Faithful, promotional efforts, and her transition from boxing toward music are described as underperforming relative to expectations. Critics argue this reduced her leverage within the industry structure she entered. From a business standpoint, Claressa's boxing career is still seen as her primary value to win records. However, as tensions with promotional partners increase and public controversies grow, some observers argue her position becomes more complicated, shifting from asset to risk over time. In this interpretation, her visibility still generates attention and revenue, but the long-term direction of that attention may not primarily benefit her music career. Instead, it is suggested that momentum may gradually shift toward other emerging figures within the label structure. Throughout all of this, Remy Ma is repeatedly positioned as someone who recognized patterns early. Whether or not every claim is accurate, her perspective is framed as consistent rather than reactive, based on long-term observation rather than sudden emotional response. As the narrative concludes, Kadia is increasingly framed not as a side figure, but as a central component within a broader strategic structure. Claressa, meanwhile, is portrayed as someone operating within that system without full visibility of its internal dynamics. If there is a broader takeaway within this interpretation, it is that public narratives often hide more complex underlying relationships. What appears as personal conflict may, in some cases, reflect deeper professional and structural alignment. Whether or not one agrees with this perspective, it highlights how layered and interconnected modern entertainment relationships can become.